Well, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm now heading up research at Patients Like Me in Cambridge, but before then I was an academic researcher in neuropsychology back in London at the Institute of Psychiatry. And what I used to say to people is you'd much rather come across me socially than professionally, because I'm sort of an expert in bad things that you don't want to have happen to you. But despite all that, I think I'm quite optimistic. And I think that's partially because in coming across people who've had things like brain injury, neurodegenerative diseases, head trauma, you get the opportunity to see people overcoming adversity in a way that you don't normally get to see in sort of your day-to-day life. And my task as a researcher was to go out to people's homes and give them a large battery of psychological tests to see what they could do and what they can't do in order to map out different brain regions. But what was always most interesting for me was what people had done to short-circuit the traditional ways of doing things. So when people with ALS could no longer brush their teeth, they might move to using an electric toothbrush. It's easy to grip, and of course you don't have to expend quite so much effort. And the little hints and tricks like that I found very interesting, and I was always sort of a little bit anxious that these ideas could not get transmitted more broadly than just me picking up an idea and then maybe when I'm talking to a patient over lunch and I see they've got this problem saying, oh, think about an electric toothbrush. And it was always frustrating to me that there wasn't just some way that this one-to-many relationship could be many-to-many. And the internet offers us one potential way that could happen. So in order to just give you a little bit of background, I want to talk in slightly more detail about what ALS is. It stands for amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. And like many terrorists, it goes by a number of AKAs. You may know it as Lou Gehrig's disease because the famous baseball player from the 1930s, Lou Gehrig, suffered with it. In the United Kingdom, it's known as motor neuron disease. But regardless of the names, the situation is the same, which is that the motor neurons that originate in your primary motor cortex and sort of originate the signal of your intentionality when you want to scratch your nose or have a cup of coffee or type or anything, those signals need to travel down your spinal cord, down the upper motor neurons, and then they synapse at the spine out through the lower motor neurons to your muscles. In ALS, these die. By the time the first symptom has been noticed, 50% of them are probably already dead. So by the time you're in the diagnostic process, you're definitely sort of in a sort of path to degeneration. And what happens, what makes this disease so terrible, is that the muscles that are innervated by these neurons, they weaken and then atrophy. So as time goes on, people are unable to walk, to operate their hands and their arms, to speak, to talk, to drink, and eventually to breathe, which is the cause of death. About 30,000 Americans have ALS at any one time, and sadly survival is only 2 to 5 years after diagnosis. There's no very effective treatment and there's certainly no cure. But again, despite this, it seems to sort of give these opportunities for moments of resiliency and heroism to arise, which is why I wanted to talk to you today about this subject with this theme of resiliency. So there's a few folks that you might know who have ALS. And the example that everybody goes to is the world-famous Professor Stephen Hawking, who really is a very unusual case. He's had ALS for more than 40 years. I know of some people who've had it for 20, 30, 35 years. No one as long as him. And because it's mostly just the motor neurons that are affected in ALS, the brain is usually not affected. Small number of people do get frontal lobe dementia, and many of them have very mild, subtle deficits that only really show up when someone like me gives them my really, really hard tests. But someone like Stephen Hawking exemplifies the problem. A brilliant mind trapped in a failing body. And despite all of his physical difficulties, he's still teaching and writing books and finding time to appear in The Simpsons and important things like that for the future of humanity. This is someone who you might not have heard about. He's a British patient. He's a man named Patrick Joyce, and he's an artist. And when he was diagnosed with ALS, he decided that this was a challenge for him. He was going to draw 100 portraits of people who, like him, had an incurable condition, incurable optimism. So he's gone and selected 100 members of the public. Some of them are patients, some of them are caregivers. This is his neurologist, Martin Turner, who's a friend of mine. And he's done these very sort of witty drawings of what really makes this person who they are. The third person I want to show you is a man called Trevor, who actually was a participant in one of my research studies. And he first got his symptoms in the bulbar region. So he lost the ability to speak, to drink beer, which was an enormous loss to him, and do other things like that. But his hands and legs remained relatively intact, which was just as well because he drove a souped-up sports car. You couldn't stop him from doing it. And his dream was to go around a Formula One track at Brands Hatch. And we actually managed to make that happen. This is a photograph from that day. And I just wanted to show you this because of this gesture that he's making, the thumbs up. The thumbs up is actually the official logo of ALS in the UK, motor neuron disease, partially because it was the last defiant gesture of the actor David Niven, who died of ALS. So to show you a more local example to Massachusetts, this is a gentleman called Steve Sailing. He was an architect, a landscape architect mostly. And when he was diagnosed with ALS, he realized that a cure probably was not going to come in time for him. But that through technology, he could overcome many of these hurdles if only the situations were set up appropriately. So he collaborated with a group to build a special set of residences for people with ALS. And through technology, they are the ones that can control the doors, the sound system, the lights, through whatever switches are available. Eye tracking, EMG switches, whistles, blow-suck switches. Whatever that person can still use is how they can control their environment. And I'm very happy to say this is a project that came to a successful resolution. This is Steve about a year or two afterwards, and you can see the contrast here. So in the first picture, he's got a walking stick, and he's still able to use his arms. In this picture, he's using an electric wheelchair. He has a head tilt switch, and you can see this atrophy in his fingers. So the wasting in between the fingers is quite typical. Just one thing to underline this is this signature here. That's the last time he ever wrote his signature with his hands. And ALS is so cruel because once you can't do something, that's the last time. The centre was completed earlier this year, and 10 people can live at it in any one time. And at the opening ceremony, Steve said this: "I really want a cure to be found, but my happiness does not depend on it. And the race for the cure, yes, it's essential. And I've been involved in that. There's a TED talk by my colleague Jamie Hayward about our race for the cure. But until the cure comes, there are thousands of people who have problems that need solving." So I think you guys are probably all feeling some sympathy for these people. If you could, you'd probably help them. So we're all going to see if we can help one of these people together. And to do that, I'm going to have to use the power invested in me by the internet and make you all doctors for the next 10 minutes. Okay? If you're already a doctor, you're still a doctor, but now you're a better doctor. Okay. So the setting here is you're a neurologist at an outpatient clinic. And you're running late, it's 5 o'clock, all your colleagues have gone home, and you've got this one last patient to see. So a 55-year-old male is going to come in, and he's got a 2-year history of ALS, so he's quite far along this path. And he's complaining of low mood, anhedonia. He's feeling helpless and hopeless, and he's having thoughts of suicide. So this is not the blues, this is not a reactive depression to the diagnosis, this is the real deal major depressive episode. And he's got only 2 questions for you. Is this normal? Will anything help? Now, you might be able to just sort of come up with an answer off the top of your head to that, but what we're supposed to do is use evidence-based medicine, right? And where all of our tax dollars are going to, and the reason why we have all these bright sparks in Boston running around with white coats, is to do research, to generate the evidence, so that the decisions that either we make or that are made on our behalf are the best decisions they can possibly be. So where are we going to look for answers to this? Textbooks or colleagues or what have you? Well, I think where a lot of people would look is the scientific literature. And now that that's online, it's a lot easier to do that. So let's go to PubMed, the big database of all the research. We're going to say, PubMed, is this normal that a person with ALS has depression? You put in depression and ALS, we get 159 hits. Now, I've also given you the power of speed reading. Only 23 of them contain data. So, wasted a bit of time there. So, well, you only have about 8 minutes to see each patient, but this is why I needed to give you speed reading. You've also spent about $4,000 to download 24-hour access to the PDFs that, by the way, you already paid for with your public funding. Only about 15% of them are open access, so free of charge. And I checked, they're not the relevant ones. I've also given you a research assistant who's compiled all those 23 important pieces of information into one place. And they're going to try and give you the answer. So is it normal? What is the estimated prevalence of depression? Well, looking at every study that's been useful that's been done since 1977, the answer is either 0% or 75% or 5 or 30, or it's not really very clear. And these sample sizes are a little pathetic, 18, 27, 190, 40. These are small numbers of cases on which to make what I think is a pretty important decision. And just, just to give you a sense of where this uncertainty is difficult, if you're trying to dress for tomorrow and I tell you the temperature is going to be somewhere between minus 26 and 80 degrees, it's going to be difficult for you to pack efficiently. This is the same problem. It's one of confidence intervals. OK, so we're going to ask PubMed, well, will anything help? Well, here I'm afraid it gets a little bit grimmer. Of those 159 hits, only 2 of them contain any advice. Neither of those have evidence to support that advice. OK, so what do the 2 say? Well, the 2 study says, will there be no controlled clinical studies of antidepressants in ALS? We don't know if they work. We don't know if they make people worse. Antidepressants can have some negative effects as well. There was a survey done of neurologists to say, well, what would you prescribe? And the only data we have was this sort of 5 is you think it's great and 0 is you think it doesn't work, and they're pretty much all a 3. So we have no specificity to the answer. And what type of dosage should we put people on? Well, say 75 milligrams of sertraline, and we'll come back to that in a sec. So we don't really have much guidance on which to do it. So what if we didn't use PubMed? What if instead we went to the place that's supposed to be the mecca of all this information for our field, and we go say, right, American Academy of Neurology, can you sort this out for us? Is it normal? Will anything help? Well, they come to the same conclusion that we do, that the prevalence is somewhere between 0 and 44%, so not particularly specific, and that there have been no controlled trials. And it says there are insufficient data to support or refute specific treatments for depression and ALS, which is level U data, which I take to mean you don't know what to do now. So what if we had a third place? What if we could have a database and see what everybody else was trying with this, so that we weren't having to do the 0 trial learning stuff? What if we could draw together that experience? That only works if everybody's sharing their data in an open way. But the potential would be not just to answer this question, but to answer any more broad question. And the way we frame that is, given my status, what is the best outcome that I can hope to achieve, and how do I get there? In this case, it might be treating depression. In another case, it might be, well, how do I get my employer to recognize that I might need to work remotely? Or in another case, it might be, how do I talk about this embarrassing symptom with my doctor or my family? So it sort of depends. So part of the motivation for this came from the experience of a family affected by ALS. And we've talked a bit about the clinical side of it. I want to show you how we would represent some of these problems in a website, in a profile, in a graph that allows you to share information and create a visual language for these problems. So this is a functional rating scale, and the higher you are on this, the more functions you have, and down to a 0 is sort of the level of function you might expect from Stephen Hawking. And you can see the rate of decline, and you can see this little stick man representing how people's different systems are doing at each time. We can also see the treatments that people are taking and the symptoms that people are experiencing. And it's the reason why it's useful and important to collect this data in a systematic fashion as opposed to an open text, more narrative, qualitative way is that you can aggregate data that's been collected systematically. So the consequence of that is that we can take people who report different levels of a symptom and put them together. So if I asked 5 of you on the same scale, we can add those all together. We have a reasonable confidence that you're all responding to the same thing. So in the case of depression, over the last couple of years, we've actually accumulated as much data altogether as the entire literature. There's about 2,500 patients in this pie chart. And this would suggest that overall, the prevalence of severe self-report depression is only about 5%. So the answer to your patient is, no, that's not exactly normal, actually. That's something we should look into and see if we can do something about it. More than that, we can also talk to the individuals. This is in a bit like Facebook. We can make contact with these people and try and make a connection with them one-to-one to find out what was helpful for them. And we can look at the treatments they're taking. So you may remember some of the drugs that we saw earlier coming back here. So yes, some of these SSRIs. And we can drill in on them. So let's look at sertraline and look at the treatment report for that. People can evaluate the efficacy of this treatment. And so here we can see that of only about 5 patients have evaluated it out of all the ones that are taking it, but they've all said that it was quite effective for them. We can also see other uses that we might not have thought of, like emotional lability, which is uncontrollable laughter and crying, or anxiety. And we're starting to see now that we're getting more data about off-label uses of medication than exist anywhere else. We can look at individual patients' evaluations and look at side effects. Side effects very important in many drugs. And look at that in the context of adherence or how much of a burden the treatment was. People can also share advice and tips. We can also take a look at some data that we might not ordinarily get access to unless it was captured scientifically in a clinical study, like the dosage. You might remember earlier I pointed out 75 milligrams of sertraline was the average dose recommended. Well, average is the important point here, because actually it turns out most people are on 50, or most people are on 100. And that average 75 milligrams kind of is not what people are taking. So that's a case where the average report there is not telling the whole story. So what we want to do then is try and go a little bit deeper. And just to bring you back to this question, I think the pie charts are great. A little bit more context is great. But my stats teacher used to teach me the only worse thing than a pie chart is 2 pie charts. So what can we do to extract some more information from this stuff? So what we can do is we can sort of dig into it and slice it out and stratify it and see if there's more insights we can get. And this is a prototype data visualization that I want to show you that we've been working on for a while. And this takes the different levels of disability, so you can see from the stick men on the side what kind of problems people might have. And you can see at each strata how many patients we have that have contributed data at this point. And we can see what proportion of them are suffering these different conditions. So we're not just going to say to our patient, well, relative to the average, because no one's average. You are here, which I think are some of the most important words in medicine. So I feel like we've accomplished the is this normal, and we can flag this up and figure out what's going to go on. Unfortunately, with research, every time you answer something, it generates more questions. And this time our patient's going to ask us, well, how many of these guys got any better then? This is a trickier one. Predictive modeling and biases and correction for that and all these things are big problems that we're trying to disentangle. But we'll take a brief shot. So we have some data on the people who were severely depressed. And when you look out 30 to 90 days, only about half of them continue to be severely depressed. When you look out even further, that proportion is smaller. That actually tallies with some research on quality of life in ALS. Paradoxically, the longer people have ALS, their quality of life actually goes up. And I'm not sure if that's a biological thing or if that's a reframing of people's priorities in life, but it's interesting, and I think it should be followed up. So the bit of did anything help? What treatments can we use? I'm not sure we're quite there yet, but I think we have a framework and we have a set of biases and tools to work with that I think one day might allow us to really get to that in an individualized way. Now, there are some caveats with that, and every scientist should berate you with caveats. Selection bias, yes, absolutely. Is this the right way of assessing depression? We can argue about that for a long time. I was making fun of confidence intervals earlier. The confidence interval for this is quite broad as well. We have attrition. I work for a for-profit company. We work with pharmaceutical industry, payers, healthcare providers, other people. Do I have a conflict of interest? You all need to dig into that stuff so we can figure out where that information comes from. So the one thing I would say, and that I think that the opportunity for the people in this room and the people on the internet and people who are interested in these problems is to watch out for the preconditions for making these enterprises successful. The most important thing to my mind is that there should be no punishment by society or anyone else or business for sharing health data. This is a common good that people are contributing to, and they shouldn't be stung by it by employers or payers or anyone else like that. We have to empower patients to understand both the risks and the benefits of sharing their health data. Numeracy and health literacy are relatively low, and we must do what we can to help that. And then finally, although I'm optimistic about technology, a lot of the great stuff that we've seen and we've talked about has come without any technology at all. So we need to ensure that we keep hold of the good things that have given us resiliency in the past, that have always allowed people to triumph over adversity with technology or not. Thank you.